I never expected a normal school day to change my life. When my daughter's teacher pulled me aside and said words I wasn't ready to hear, it forced me to face feelings I had buried for years. Behind that moment was loss, guilt, and a life rebuilt piece by piece after everything collapsed. This is the story of how one quiet conversation opened a door I thought was closed forever. Hello, my name is Brian. I'm 34 years old. I live in a quiet American suburb. Nothing special, just rows of similar houses, trimmed lawns, and streets that get very quiet after sunset. I work as an engineer for a mid-sized company. It's stable work. Not exciting, but reliable. Most days I leave early in the morning and come back in the evening, tired but grateful that the lights are still on and the house is warm. My life today is simple and very structured. It has to be. I wake up before the kids, make coffee, pack lunches, check backpacks, and remind myself that this routine is what keeps us moving forward. I take my son to school every morning, then drive straight to work. After work, I pick him up, help with homework, cook dinner, and we sit together in the living room until bedtime. Some days feel heavy. Some days feel almost normal. I've learned not to expect more than that. From the outside, my life probably looks calm. A working father, a stable job, a quiet home. But calm doesn't mean full. Calm doesn't mean healed. It just means controlled. There was a time when this house sounded different. There was laughter in the kitchen, music playing in the evenings, arguments over small things that didn't really matter. My wife filled every corner of our life without even trying. She made ordinary days feel alive. Back then, I thought this was permanent. I thought we had time. I don't talk about her easily. Not because I don't want to remember, but because remembering still hurts in a way that surprises me. People assume grief fades cleanly with time. It doesn't. It just changes shape. It becomes quieter, heavier, more private. The day I lost her started like any other. There was no sign, no warning. She left the house in the morning like she always did. A quick kiss, a reminder to call later, nothing dramatic. I went to work. Meetings, emails, deadlines. Life was moving forward like it always had. Then my phone rang. At first, I didn't understand what I was hearing. Words like accident, highway, hospital didn't connect in my head. I remember standing up from my desk without knowing why, grabbing my keys, driving too fast without realizing it. The hospital lights were too bright. The hallway smelled like disinfectant and fear. They told me she didn't make it. There was no long goodbye. No last conversation. Just silence where her voice should have been. I remember sitting in a small room, staring at the wall, trying to understand how one phone call could erase an entire future. How a normal morning could turn into the end of everything we planned. The days after that are blurry. Paperwork. Questions. People saying they were sorry. Our son asking when mom was coming home. That question broke me in ways I didn't know were possible. I learned very quickly how to cry without making a sound. I didn't fall apart completely. I didn't have the luxury. There was a child watching me, learning how to survive by watching how I handled the worst moment of our lives. So I stood up. I went to work again. I learned how to cook meals I had never cooked before. I learned how to braid routines together where a person used to be. At night, when the house was quiet, I felt it all. The guilt. The what-ifs. The constant thought that if I had called earlier, if she had left 5 minutes later, if any small thing had been different, she might still be here. Those thoughts don't leave. You just stop inviting them in during the day. Time passed. Not because I wanted it to, but because it doesn't wait. My son grew older. School became part of our daily rhythm. Mornings became about backpacks and schedules instead of grief. I learned how to show up even when I felt empty. At school, I kept my head down. I wasn't there to make connections or small talk. I was there to be a father. Teachers came and went. Conversations stayed short and polite. That was easier. Safer. I told myself that this was enough. That love belonged in the past. That my job now was to raise my child and keep our life stable. I didn't think about dating. I didn't think about starting over. I thought those chapters were closed. What I didn't know then was that life doesn't always ask for permission before opening a new door. And sometimes, it starts with something very small. A routine day. A familiar hallway. A simple conversation that feels different for reasons you can't explain yet. I didn't realize how much effort it took just to keep going until the days started stacking on top of each other. 1 week turned into months, months into years. On the surface, my life stabilized. Inside, everything felt unfinished. Mornings became automatic. I woke up before the alarm, made breakfast, checked the weather, packed lunches. I learned how to smile in a way that didn't invite questions. At work, I focused on numbers, plans, systems. Engineering helped in that way. Problems had logic. Causes had effects. Unlike life, most things could be fixed. Evenings were harder. After homework and dinner, when the house grew quiet, I felt her absence more clearly. The empty chair at the table. The silence where her voice used to be. Some nights I sat on the edge of the bed longer than necessary, just listening to the house breathe. People around me slowly stopped mentioning her name. Not because they forgot, but because they assumed enough time had passed. Time doesn't erase anything. It just teaches you how to carry it without dropping everything else. My son adjusted faster than I expected. Children are stronger than we give them credit for. He asked fewer questions as time went on, but sometimes, out of nowhere, he would say something simple that would pull the ground out from under me. A memory, a comparison, a casual mention of how his mom used to do something differently. Those moments reminded me that I wasn't the only one living with loss. I was responsible not just for myself, but for someone who was still learning how the world works. School became a central part of our life. Meetings, events, notes sent home in backpacks. I attended everything I could. I wanted my son to know that even though his world had changed, he wasn't alone in it. That's when I started noticing the teacher. At first, there was nothing unusual. Monica was professional, calm, attentive. She spoke clearly, listened carefully, and treated every child with patience. When we talked, it was always about schoolwork, behavior, progress. Short conversations at the classroom door. Polite nods in the hallway. But there were small things that stood out. The way she spoke directly to my son, never down to him. The way she noticed when he was quieter than usual. Once, she gently mentioned that he seemed tired lately and asked if everything was all right at home. There was no judgment in her voice, just concern. I thanked her and kept my answer short. I wasn't ready to explain my life to anyone, especially not to someone who saw my child every day. Over time, those brief conversations became slightly longer. Still appropriate, still professional, but warmer. She started mentioning positive things too. How well my son helped others. How thoughtful he was. Hearing that mattered more than I expected. I noticed that she always waited until the hallway was almost empty before speaking to me. Not hiding, just choosing quieter moments. I told myself it meant nothing. Teachers do that. It was my job not to read into things. But there were moments when I felt seen. Not as a widower. Not as a problem. Just as a man doing his best. I wasn't used to that. One afternoon, she asked if I had a minute. Her tone was casual. I almost said no out of habit. But I stayed. She talked about a school project, then shifted the conversation gently. Asked how my son was adjusting lately. Asked how I was holding up. The question caught me off guard. People usually asked how the kids were. Rarely me. I answered honestly, but carefully. Said we were managing. Said some days were harder than others. She listened without interrupting, without trying to fix anything. When I finished, she simply nodded and said she was glad my son had such a steady father. That word stayed with me. Steady. I drove home that day thinking about it. I hadn't thought of myself that way. I felt tired, unsure, often afraid of failing. But maybe steadiness wasn't about feeling strong. Maybe it was about showing up anyway. After that, Monica started finding small reasons to speak with me. A quick update. A reminder. Nothing inappropriate. Nothing obvious. But consistent. And each time, the conversations felt easier. I told myself not to cross lines. I was very aware of boundaries. She was my son's teacher. I was still grieving. I didn't want confusion. I didn't want complications. And yet, I noticed the way she looked at me when she thought I wasn't paying attention. There was kindness there. And something else I wasn't ready to name. I didn't feel excited. I felt uneasy. Because feeling anything at all was dangerous. Feelings meant vulnerability. And vulnerability had once cost me everything. Still, life kept moving forward. One evening, my son mentioned her name casually at dinner. Said she helped him after class. Said she asked about me. Not in a strange way. Just curiosity. I nodded and changed the subject, but my chest felt tight. I realized then that this wasn't just in my head. Something was shifting. A week later, after school, she asked me to wait for a moment. Her voice was calm, but there was something different in it. The hallway was almost empty. Parents had already left. The building felt quiet. She stepped slightly aside, giving us privacy without making it uncomfortable. She looked nervous, then steady. That was when I understood that whatever was coming next would change things, one way or another. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't walk away from it. The days after that moment in the hallway felt different, even though nothing on the surface had changed. I went back to my routine. Work, school runs, dinners, bedtime stories. Everything looked the same, but I felt more aware of each moment, as if my life had slightly shifted off its usual track. At work, I caught myself drifting more than usual. Not in a reckless way, just distracted. I stared at my screen longer, reread emails twice, checked the time more often. It bothered me. I prided myself on control, on structure. This felt like a crack in something I had worked hard to build. School mornings continued as always. My son rushed to grab his backpack, complained about homework, asked questions about things I didn't always know how to answer. I listened, responded, stayed present. Being a father had become the most stable part of who I was. At school, Monica remained professional. Nothing changed in how she spoke or behaved in front of others. But there was a softness in her voice when she spoke to me now, a quiet familiarity that hadn't been there before. Our conversations stayed appropriate, but they carried more weight. She noticed details, asked how my son was sleeping, mentioned his focus during class. She didn't exaggerate praise or dramatize concerns. Everything she said felt grounded, honest. It made me trust her more than I intended to. One afternoon, she stopped me to share something positive. She said my son had helped another student without being asked, that he showed patience and kindness. She looked at me and said those things usually come from home. I didn't know how to respond. Pride mixed with something deeper. Grief, maybe, because hearing that reminded me of my wife too. She had always believed kindness mattered more than achievement. I thanked Monica and left, but I carried that moment with me for the rest of the day. At home, I watched my son more closely. The way he concentrated, the way he asked thoughtful questions, the way he still sometimes hesitated before speaking. I saw both his strength and his vulnerability, and I felt the weight of responsibility settle deeper in my chest. That night, after he went to bed, I sat alone in the living room. I didn't turn on the television. I just sat there, listening to the quiet. My thoughts kept returning to the hallway, to Monica's expression, to the calm certainty in her voice. I asked myself questions I hadn't allowed before. What would it mean to let someone close again? What would it say about me if I did? Whether love was something you could choose again, or if it had to find you unexpectedly. I didn't answer any of them. The next few weeks passed slowly. Conversations with Monica became a regular part of my afternoons. Always brief, always respectful, but no longer stiff. Sometimes she smiled when she saw me approaching. Not the polite smile people use out of habit. A real one. I noticed how she interacted with the children. Calm but firm. Warm without being indulgent. She didn't seek attention. She didn't try to stand out. She simply did her job well. One day, while waiting for my son, I saw her kneeling beside a child who was clearly upset. She listened carefully, spoke quietly, placed a reassuring hand on the desk. The moment stayed with me. Compassion like that isn't taught easily. It comes from experience. I wondered about her life. I knew very little. Her age, her job, nothing else. She never volunteered personal details. That restraint made me respect her more. Another afternoon, she asked if I had a minute and mentioned an upcoming school event. As we talked, the conversation drifted naturally. She asked how long we had lived in the area. I told her about the house, about moving there years ago, about how it used to feel like the right place for a growing family. She listened carefully. Then she said quietly that life doesn't always stay where we plan it. I looked at her, surprised. It wasn't something you say casually. It came from understanding. There was a pause. Not awkward, just honest. I realized then that she wasn't just interested in me. She understood me. Or at least, she was trying to. That realization made me uneasy. Understanding can be more intimate than attraction. It invites closeness. It asks for trust. I started setting boundaries in my own head. Reminded myself that she was my son's teacher. That my life was complicated. That grief doesn't disappear just because someone kind walks into your world. And yet, when she spoke, I felt calmer. When I saw her, the constant tension in my chest eased slightly. It wasn't excitement. It was relief. One evening, my son mentioned that Monica had asked about me again. Asked how work was going. Asked if I seemed tired lately. He said it without suspicion, without meaning. Just a child repeating something he noticed. I smiled and said she was very thoughtful. Inside, my heart beat faster. I realized that whatever this was, it wasn't one-sided. And that made it impossible to ignore. I spent a long night thinking about my wife. About loyalty. About guilt. About whether moving forward meant leaving her behind. The answer, I knew, was no. Love doesn't disappear just because life continues. The next day, when I saw Monica waiting near the classroom door, I felt it again. That quiet shift. That sense that something was approaching. She looked at me, hesitated slightly, then asked if we could talk for a moment after school. I nodded. I didn't know what she was going to say. I only knew that I wasn't ready to walk away anymore. School ended quietly that afternoon. Parents picked up their children, voices faded down the hallway, doors closed one by one. I waited near the classroom like she asked, unsure of what I was waiting for exactly. My son had already gone ahead with a friend, and for the first time, I was standing there alone, without a clear role. Monica stepped out of the classroom and closed the door behind her. She looked composed, but I could see tension in her shoulders. Not fear, more like determination. She asked me to walk a few steps with her, just far enough that we wouldn't be overheard. We stopped near the window at the end of the hallway. The light was soft, late afternoon sun reflecting off the floor. She took a breath before speaking. She said she wanted to be clear and respectful, that she had thought about this for a long time, that she understood my situation, my past, and my responsibility as a father. She said she would never want to complicate my life or make anything harder for my son. I listened without interrupting. My heart was beating faster than I wanted it to, not from excitement, but from the weight of the moment. Then she looked directly at me, not like a teacher, not like someone making a polite comment, like a woman speaking honestly. She said, "A man like you is a dream for any woman." The words didn't land immediately. They felt unreal, like they belonged in someone else's life. I stood there, silent, trying to understand what I was feeling. Surprise, gratitude, fear, and something warm that I hadn't felt in years. She didn't rush me. She didn't step closer. She simply continued, saying she wasn't asking for anything, that she just needed me to know how she felt, that if the answer was no, she would respect it completely and nothing would change at school. That mattered to me, more than she probably realized. I told her the truth, that I wasn't ready for anything serious, that I still carried my wife with me every day, that some mornings I felt strong, and others I barely held things together. I told her I didn't want to hurt anyone by pretending I was further along than I was. She listened the same way she always did, without interrupting, without judging. She said she wasn't looking to replace anyone, that she understood grief doesn't end, it just becomes part of who you are. She said she admired the way I showed up for my son, even when it was clearly hard. There was silence between us, not uncomfortable, honest. I told her I didn't know what the right next step was, but that I didn't want to pretend this conversation hadn't happened. I didn't want to push it away out of fear. She nodded and said that was enough for now. We agreed to take things slowly, outside of school, carefully, with boundaries, with honesty. That evening, I drove home differently, slower, more aware of the road, the houses, the quiet movement of life around me. At home, my son talked about his day, and for the first time in a long while, I found myself smiling without forcing it. Later that night, after he went to bed, I sat alone and thought about my wife. I didn't feel like I was betraying her. I felt like I was honoring the life we built by continuing to live. I realized that letting someone care about me didn't erase the past. It simply meant I wasn't standing alone in the present anymore. We didn't rush anything after that conversation. In fact, nothing dramatic happened at first. Life continued in small, ordinary steps. Monica and I agreed to keep everything outside of school and away from my son until we were certain. There were no secret meetings, no emotional swings. Just quiet decisions made with care. Our first meeting outside of school was simple. Coffee at a small place not far from my house. No long looks, no promises. We talked like two adults who had lived real lives. She told me about her work, why she became a teacher, how much responsibility she felt toward her students. I told her about engineering, about how structure helped me survive after the accident. We didn't avoid the past, but we didn't let it dominate the present either. What surprised me most was how calm I felt around her. Not excited, not nervous. Calm. Like my body recognized something safe before my mind could analyze it. We took weeks before I introduced her to my son outside of school. When I finally did, it wasn't framed as something serious. Just someone I knew. Someone I trusted. She approached him gently, without trying to impress or step into a role that wasn't hers. That mattered more than anything. My son accepted her naturally. Children sense honesty faster than adults do. He didn't replace anyone in his heart. He simply made space. There were difficult moments. Nights when guilt crept in and I wondered if I was moving on too fast. Days when memories of my wife came back sharply, triggered by something small. Monica never tried to compete with those memories. She gave them room. She understood that love doesn't arrive to erase what came before it. Over time, routines began to blend. Dinners together, weekend walks, homework at the table while we cooked. Nothing dramatic, just life taking shape again. Eventually, we talked openly about the future, about living together, about stability, about being careful not just with our hearts, but with my son's sense of security. When we decided to move forward, it wasn't a leap. It was a step that felt overdue. We built our life quietly. Monica moved in. My house didn't feel like a place frozen in the past anymore. It felt lived in again. Not loud, not perfect, just real. There was no moment where grief disappeared, but it stopped controlling every decision. My wife remained part of my story, not a shadow over it. I learned that honoring her didn't mean staying alone forever. It meant continuing to live with the same honesty we once shared. Today, when I come home from work, the house is warm again. My son does his homework at the table. Monica prepares dinner. We talk about our days. Ordinary conversations that once felt impossible. I didn't get a second chance at the same life. I got something different. Something built slowly, carefully, and with respect for everything that came before. And that is how our story ends. Not with a perfect beginning, but with a real one.